And look at verse 53. It says, "And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in all the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all lands." All right, so this third famine was prophesied and prepared for by Joseph. They would have called him a prepper in his day. While this famine was over all the earth, it appears that Egypt and Canaan were the nations most greatly affected. Look at chapter 43. We see it's in all the lands. It was over all the face of the earth. But it seems like the famine was most sore upon Egypt and Canaan. Look at Genesis 43, verse 1. "And the famine was sore in the land." That'd be the land of Canaan. Okay, the famine was sore in the land. So that's the land of Canaan. Go to Genesis 47. Pretty much from Genesis 41 to just about near the end of the book, you're dealing with a famine. You're dealing with Joseph and his brothers and Jacob in Egypt. All right, 47:13. "And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine." So while the famine was over all the face of the earth, what's most important to notice is that it seems like it was worse in Egypt and Canaan. Okay, so there's a extra level of judgment or punishment or persecution or famine on Egypt and Canaan, and that's because God centers a lot of his attention in the Bible on those two places. Those two places are very much on God's radar for one reason or another. Look at go back to 43, chapter 43. Someone's chair's fixing to break. You might want to use that or some grind. What is it? That's one of the good chairs. So.
Yeah, it's been a bad chair for a while.
All right. Well. Oh. If we need to, we can just swap that thing out for something else. I was thinking we needed someone hitting the floor in the middle of the service.
It's an edit.
All right. Chapter 43. Look at verse 1 again. "And the famine was sore in the land," so that's the land of Canaan. "And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, Go again, buy us a little food." So remember what famines do. Famines produce movement. And so what God's trying to do is he's trying to get Jacob and his sons into Egypt permanently. And he's having them make this trek back and forth to get food until it runs out. And at that point, we know how the end of the story goes. But this famine eventually leads Jacob into Egypt. Go over to 45, chapter 45. This famine eventually drives Jacob into Egypt. Look at verse 28. "And Israel said, It is enough. Joseph my son is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. And Israel took his journey with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifice unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob." That should remind you of how God spoke to Abraham and Samuel. "And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt." So here God's telling him to go down into Egypt. Other places in the Bible, they're told not to go down into Egypt. In Jeremiah, they're told not to go down into Egypt. When Abraham and Isaac go down to Egypt in their famine, it produces some pretty good opportunity for sin to have happened there. And of course, God stepped in front of all that stuff. So here he's saying, go down to Egypt, and I will surely bring thee up again. And Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, and their little ones, and their wives, in wagons, which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. So the whole famine, that being sore in the land of Egypt and Canaan, and over all the face of the earth, but primarily Canaan and Egypt, was to get Jacob and his sons into the land of Egypt, where they would stay for quite some time, until eventually what? God gets them out of Egypt and gets them back into the promised land, which, oh, by the way, was just the same place they just came from. Boggles the mind. They were already in Canaan. God took them out of Canaan, put them in Egypt, only to turn around and bring them back out of Egypt into Canaan. And they had no problem going from Egypt to Canaan at all, right? It doesn't sound like there's any sort of adversarial people in the way. They didn't have to worry about Amalekites or Philistines. They had no problem traversing back and forth between Canaan and Egypt. They did it multiple times. With, you would think there'd be marauders in between as there's a famine in the land. These guys are going back and forth with money, with spices and food. You think there'd be people on the path that would rob them. They never had any problem at all going from Canaan to Egypt. And yet somehow later on in the Bible, when they come out of Egypt, it takes them forever to get there. Over 40 years to get there. God's got them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. What's that about? It boggles the mind. All right. So they would stay in Egypt for 215 years, and then after the 215 years are over, God sends Moses and Aaron and deliver them out. All right, that's the third famine. Let's go to the fourth famine, Job chapter 30. Job chapter 30. This would be the fourth famine. And I don't think I had this one in my notes last week, so I've actually added to the list the number of famines. So I think we're up to 15, maybe. Let's see, Job number 30, Job chapter 30. And this would be verse number 3, Job 30, verse number 3. For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. They were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys, in caves of the earth, and in the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed. Under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. So there is no definitive date as to when this famine takes place. I've got it down as it could have taken place somewhere between Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, which is the first famine, and Genesis chapter 26, verse 10, which is the second famine. That's because when you're dealing with Job, remember Job's the first book technically in the Bible. He'd be the oldest writer technically in the Bible. And so he's writing about famine that took place. It's not the famine of Abraham's day, because he lived before Abraham shows up. So this famine is somewhere between the first and second famine. The date is unknown. It is, of course, a picture of one of the future famines, which would be the one in the tribulation, right? It's a great type picture of a tribulational famine that we'll get to. Now, something that you preppers might like, if you are a prepper, or if you want to know, what should we do if a famine comes. This passage shows what could be eaten during a famine. And so, verse 4, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. So you can eat off the land. You can eat herbs, and you can eat things that grow in the wild. Just make sure you know what you're eating. Make sure you've got a pretty good idea of what things you can eat, what things you can't. Apparently you can eat juniper roots. That does not sound delicious. Juniper gives me rash like nothing else. Maybe the root is got some properties in it that wouldn't cause an internal rash. All right, that's the fourth famine. Let's go to the fifth famine. Go to Ruth chapter 1. This will be the fifth famine. So you had to go, you say Ruth that comes before Job, but remember Job again is the oldest book in the Bible technically. And had I caught that Job one before last week, I would have put it before the third famine we just covered in Joseph's day. But day late, dollar short, I guess. So here's the fifth famine. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So this is, of course, is during the time of the judges, right? This is after the 12 tribes got into the land of Canaan. This is after that. This is after, Joshua is off the scene and there's nobody, no king in the land. So everybody did that which is right in his own eyes, right? And so that's when this famine takes place. It takes place during the book of Judges. And the date for this is about 1322 BC. So if you wanted to go back and find out about when this famine took place, you could go into the book of Judges. If you've got dates at the top of the heading there, you could try to figure out around what judge it was. But it'd be around 1322 BC that this famine took place. All right, it was the result. Remember I said too how what brings about famines is sin in the land. The one with Joseph was the sin of his brothers. The reason why God brought a famine in the land was because of Joseph's brothers' sin. And that affected the whole world. So the sin of, just a few brothers, 11 brothers, 10 brothers there, caused a famine in the entire world. And even greater so in all of Canaan and all of Egypt. The sin here, well, of course, the sin in Job, it says that they were foolish children, they were vile than any person, so there was sin that was just prevalent in the land. But the sin here is the sin that there was no king in the land. And every man did that which is right in his own eyes. And you read the book of Judges, and they're worshiping all sorts of gods, they're doing whatever they feel like is right. So for that, God sends a famine in the land. And of course, the land there being the land of Canaan. All right, what did it do? It produced movement. Look at verse 2. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they came into the country of Moab and continued there. So again, famines produce movement. And here it was to move the family out of Canaan and into Moab. And then this famine, it's unbelievable, this famine lasts approximately 10 years. Look at verse 4. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And so here you find that they're in Moab for 10 years. And then after they're in Moab for 10 years, they go back to Canaan. So it could have been a shorter famine. Obviously, they could have just stayed in Moab longer. But the timeline given here is 10 years they're out of the land. And so for that, you could say the famine lasts up to 10 years. No more than 10 years. That's a long time if that's how long it lasts. That's a long time. All right, now let's look at the 6th famine. Go to 2 Samuel 21. This is the 6th famine, 2 Samuel 21. Again, a whole lot more study could be done on each of these. But I really want to get us to our next set of studies. 2 Samuel 21. And verse 1. 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. Then was there a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, It is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. All right, so this famine here was a famine in the land of Israel, which is Canaan, took place in the days of King David, and the famine was a result of somebody's sin. Yep. Say it again, there's sin there. Every time you see a famine, there's sin somewhere in the passage. And the sin here is the sin of Saul. Now, the sin of Saul didn't take place at the time of this famine. God delayed the famine. Yeah. So a sin that God could judge a land for might have happened, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And God's like, now's the time the famine's going to come in. So this was for Saul's sin, for killing the Gibeonites, I should say. and then God brought about this famine, and it lasted a total of 3 years. All right, now, of course, it says 3 years here, but this famine could have lasted for a total of 7 years. So this famine here says to have lasted 3 years, but God could have tacked on an additional time on the back end of this thing to have made it a 7-year famine. For that, look at 2 Samuel 24. So 1 year after another, they're going through a famine. And then for somebody's sin, God could have brought in 4 more years to this 3-year famine, making a total of 7 years. And it would have been because of somebody's sin. Look at 2 Samuel 24 and verse number 1. And again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. And so here, David goes and has Joab number the people. And that's a sin. God didn't want that to take place. He allowed, God takes credit, but later on you'll read that it was the devil that did it. And David goes and numbers the people against God's wish, against God's will. And for that, God's going to allow David to choose his judgment. We talk about a tricky situation.
Yeah.
God says you can choose your own judgment. Now David does the right thing. He says, Lord, you choose, you know. But look at one of the judges that could have come again on the back end of the 3 years. They just finished up the 3-year famine, right?
Yeah.
And probably as a result of that, a lot of people probably died.
Yeah.
And so the idea there is how many are left over since this famine, and that's the idea. So that's how he kind of got David to number the people. Was he wants to know what's he got left as far as the military goes, as far as people goes, and so God gives options for judgment, and one of those options could have been 4 additional years on the back end of those 3. Look at chapter 24, verse 10. And David's heart smote him after that he had numbered the people. And David said unto the Lord, I have sinned, see? I have sinned greatly in that I have done. And now I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. That's a great way to pray. For when David was up in the morning, the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say unto David, Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it unto thee. And you're thinking Porsche, Ferrari, or Lamborghini. And you're like, no, that's not the options. No, sorry. So Gad came to David and told him and said unto him, Shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in thy land? Now that's not 7 more years. That's 7 years. That's 4 on top of the 3 that he just come out of, for a total of 7 years. Shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in the land? Or wilt thou flee 3 months before thine enemies while they pursue thee? Or that there be 3 days pestilence in thy land? Now advise and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. All right, look at 1 Chronicles 21 as a cross reference to this. 1 Chronicles 21. The story is given twice. So the 6th famine was a 3-year famine that could have turned into a total of 7 years had God brought it in, but he chose a different course of judgment. 1 Chronicles 21, look at verse number 12. You're dealing with the same passage. You're dealing with the same sort of, set of circumstances, but look how the Lord gives the option here. Verse 12. Either 3 years famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before thy foes, while that the sword of thine enemies overtake thee, or else 3 days the sword of the Lord, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the coasts of Israel. Now therefore advise thyself what word I shall bring again to him that sent me. So here you find that it's not 7 more years, right? It's an additional time back on top of the time that was already spent having gone through a famine. Here he's saying 3 years. There he's saying 7 years. So there's a space of about 12 months that's missing. And apparently God is including within that the time at which Joab was numbering the people, which we said was approximately about 9 months. 9 months. So all told, between the time he's numbering the people, the 3 years of famine, the 3 years additional famine, all of it would have accompanied or would have accumulated up to a sum total of 7 years. All that being said, it was just over 3 years, about 3 years and 9 months of the famine that God brought in for Saul's sin. Okay. All right, now the seventh famine. Look at 1 Kings chapter 18. So the famine doesn't come as a result of David's sin. It was only as a result of Saul's sin. It was only 3 years and 9 months. Still, it's a pretty lengthy amount of time.
Amen.
You know, yeah, amen. Yeah. 1 Kings 18. 18. Here's the seventh famine. Look at verse 1. And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. And Elijah went to show himself unto Ahab, and there was a sore famine in Samaria. So you've seen this word accompany the word famine. Sore means grievous, extreme famine, if you will. And notice it's a result of there not being any rain. Remember I said before, there's lots of reasons why there might be a famine in the land. Yeah. And one of those reasons is there's no rain. And of course, who controls the weather? It's God. Amen. And so God says there's not going to be any rain. You can pretty much book it. You're going to have a famine sometime soon. And now here it says that it was in the 3rd year. It came to Elijah in the 3rd year. And then he says there was a famine, a sore famine in Samaria. So it's possible that this famine was in the 3rd year of a famine already. It was in the 3rd year of it. All right, so this famine takes place in the land of Samaria, which is Israel. It's northern Israel, up where Ephraim was, the capital of Ephraim, during the days of Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel. Samaria was known for its idolatry and paganism. Look at chapter 16. So for the sins of Samaria, Ahab and Jezebel, being king and queen, God sent in a famine. 1 Kings 16. Look at verse 23. No, that's not the right number. Look at verse 29. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. Well, you think every 4 years is tough. Or at most 8. Yeah. Imagine having Ahab as your president for 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took the wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal. You'll notice the word Baal there. King of the Zidonians. That's where we get our alphabet from, is the Phoenician alphabet. And went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. So what you see here is that Ahab's a wicked king. He's got a wicked wife, wicked queen. And for that, God brings a famine in the land. So God will bring famines for the sins of its rulers. All right, now this famine was prophesied. Look at 1 Kings 17, verse 1. This famine was prophesied in 1 Kings 17:1. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And so here, God pronounces judgment upon the land through his prophet Elijah, that there be no rain, no dew, and of course this brings in a famine. It's only given as lasting 3 years, but look at chapter 18, verse 1 again. It says, And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year. So in the 3rd year means we are into the 3rd year. So we are not just year 3, we are year 3 plus, right? So in the 3rd year, somewhere between the 3rd year and the 4th year, this story here in 1 Kings 18 takes place. So you could say in the 3.5 years, in the 3rd year and half a year, in 3.5 years is when we see this account take place. Okay, It's possible that this famine lasted approximately 3.5 years to match a 3.5 year famine in the future, which would be the tribulation period. All right, that's the 7th famine. Let's look at the 8th famine, 2 Kings. 2 Kings. And of course, Elijah would be a great person to have a famine take place during his time on earth, because Elijah shows up in the tribulation as one of the 2 witnesses alongside Moses. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 25. And that 7th famine took place, no idea. The 6th and the 7th, no date given for that.
About 890 something BC.
Is that what you got?
Yeah.
Okay. Because this 8th famine is 893. This 8th famine is 893. 2 Kings 6, verse 25. So somewhere around all this, 893 BC, we have this 8th famine, 2 Kings 6, verse 25. And there was a great famine in Samaria. This is the second time we've got a famine in the land of Samaria. Again, it's still Israel, but this is after the 10 tribes departed and went north, and 2 tribes went south. So those 10 northern tribes, the capital, or the capital of those 10 tribes is Samaria, which is located inside Ephraim. And that's where they went and set up false gods. The 2 southern tribes were Judah and Benjamin, and that had Jerusalem. All right, and so of course that is the right place to have the temple set up and to have as your capital city of Israel is Jerusalem. But when they had that split, they had to make a new place of worship. Lest he was afraid, Jeroboam was afraid that taking these 10 tribes, if he were to leave the place of worship in Judah and Jerusalem there, that they might join back up, and he'd lose his military, and he'd lose his influence, and he'd lose his power. So he said, we have to just make a replica so they don't need to go down there. They can just get it here, see? And so that's where they build these false gods, was in Samaria. And that's why when God shows up to that woman at the well, he says, us Samaritans don't have to be dealing with you Jews. Because they know that the Jews don't see them too favorably, especially from those southern 2 tribes. And of course, what Nebuchadnezzar does, or one of those kings does, is he takes the inhabitants of the land at that time out, and he puts other people from the other nations into the land. Yeah. He replaces the Jews there and stockpiles it with his people, and then he says, hey, we know this God. This God is a mighty God. He's a vengeful God. We need to learn about this God and how to do things. So he goes and gets some priests and teaches the people how to worship God their way. You can see this thing taking place in Laodicea. All right, 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 25. It says, there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver. So 80 pieces of silver was the cost of a donkey's head. And the 4th part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. Now, I don't know what that would cost you today, but if you could think of just eating the dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver, sure, there's food available to you, whether it be mallow or juniper root, or it could be the head of a donkey or the rear end of a dove, if you're so hungry. Be careful what you pray for. God, we need a famine to teach people. I don't know. Again, a famine is a whole lot more than not being able to get your Frosted Flakes, in bulk. So this famine in Samaria was for the sins of Samaria. This famine takes place during the days of the prophet Elisha and the king Jehoram and Joram, who is the son of Ahab, and probably lasted for only a year. If you go back and look, well, actually look at chapter 8, verse 16. We'll look at that, chapter 8, verse 16. It says, in the 5th year of Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being then king of Judah, Joram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, began to reign. So that gives you who was in charge. And you can see here is the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel. So this shows you that the apple don't fall too far from the tree. And so Ahab had a famine in his days, and Joram in the nation of Israel, Samaria, has a famine in their days, all because of the same sins. And this famine is said to have only lasted about a year. Nevertheless, the 9th famine comes about a year or two after that. Look at 2 Kings chapter 8, You're already there. 2 Kings chapter 8. Look at verse 17. 32 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as did the house of Ahab. And for the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Let's see, we got to figure out where this famine shows up. Where is this famine? I know it's here somewhere. Let me just... I'm looking for the reference to the woman that's told to get out of Dodge for a while. Where is that? There it is, in 2 Kings chapter 8. I was reading the wrong verse. There it is, 2 Kings chapter 8. I don't know what I was reading, but it wasn't that. 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. Then spake Elisha unto the woman, whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise, and go thou and thine household, and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn. For the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. So here we have a 7-year famine again. And this is after the 1-year famine they just had. Here we've got that lasted, like I said, about a year, maybe 2. But if it didn't last 2 years and it only lasted 1, that means they had 1 year of reprieve. And then God's going to calls for a second famine, back to back almost. And this was going to last for 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God. She went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. What does famines produce? It produces movement. So God's going to move this woman out of her land and into the land of the Philistines for 7 years. And it came to pass at the 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth to cry to the king for her house and for her land. All right, so this famine is in the land of Shunem, which is associated with the northern Israel and the Jezreel Valley of Samaria. So again, it's the third famine that's affected primarily the area of Samaria. The famine was also in the days of Elisha and King Joram. Joram gets 2 famines, one for 7 years and one for 1 year. So he gets an 8-year famine. His daddy only got about a 3.5-year famine. So God's doubling up on that. This famine lasts 7 years, matching the third famine of 7 years in Egypt, and a future 7 years of famine in the tribulation. So again, what you're reading here is a type picture of a future famine. All of these famines really are going to get us to the place where we have typology of the famine that's about to hit the world after our rapture. That's what all of these famines are about. They're just showing you what is going to come about when we are gone, what it's going to be like in the world for 7 years. It's going to be a very sore famine, a very grievous famine. God's going to call for this famine. It's a famine that's going to span over the course of 7 years. It could come in increments of 3.5 and 3.5. There could be a reprieve in between. But it's going to be for the sin of the nation of Israel. Right? That's why they're there. It's for their sin of crucifying their Savior. Right. And it's to get them to move back to God. Okay? That's what it's all about. That's why we're looking at these famines. It shows you a pattern. And what you need to know about the future is you have to find a pattern for it in the past. Yeah. When you hit your Bible, if you have not seen a pattern, it's probably something taken out of context. Or you haven't rightly divided the Bible. Or it's being misinterpreted. God is a God of patterns. Okay? You will never find a time in the Bible where God has not patterned a thing out to bring it to pass. Okay? Everything God does is based upon a pattern. And the pattern is sin equals death. Yep. Adam's sin brought about death. And how God chooses to carry out that death can be by various means and circumstances, but one of the ways he does it is through famines. Right. Other ways he does it is through pestilence. Other way he does it is through wars. Other ways he does it is through cataclysmic events, whether it be flood, fire, earthquake. What is that? It's a pattern. To lead up to what? Something in the future, which will be the tribulation. Okay? All right, so let's look at the 10th famine, 2 Kings chapter 25. That's all the Bible is. It's a Bible of patterns to follow after. If you're seeing a thing for the first time, then you have to make sure that you understand this is the first time a thing has happened, and there has to now be a pattern of that thing happening throughout the Bible to get me out to the right interpretation of the first thing. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if you only have a one-time thing only, it's a thing taken out of context. Okay. God will never do a thing once and then not see it repeated in some form or fashion later on down the road. Otherwise, it's a thing taken out of context. All right, 2 Kings 25, look at verse 3. 2 Kings 25, verse 3. This will be the last one of the Old Testament. And on the ninth day of the fourth famine, in the ninth day of the fourth month, the famine prevailed in the city. And here it is, and there was no bread. So here's your definition of what is a famine. No bread, no water. And there was no bread for the people of the land. So here's your Judah, kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, Benjamin, going into captivity. The 10 northern tribes have already gone into captivity. Somewhere between 700 and 800 BC there. They've already gone into captivity under Sennacherib. This is the 2 southern tribes going under captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? This would have taken place somewhere around 588 BC. 588 BC. This famine was in the city of Jerusalem in the days of the prophet Jeremiah and King Jeremiah. Prophet Jeremiah and King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon and King Zedekiah from Jerusalem. This famine lasts 2 years. This famine is a result of there being no bread. And this famine is a result of Jerusalem's sins. Let's go to Jeremiah 52. This famine is a result of Jerusalem's sins. And it lasts 2 years. Jeremiah 52. Let's start there. Jeremiah 52. Nebuchadnezzar is a great type picture of the Antichrist. Jeremiah 52, verse 1. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. 11 is the number of judgment. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, till he had cast them out of his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now, folks, something you need to understand. That right before God sends Israel or Judah into captivity, Zedekiah is rebelling against the king, Nebuchadnezzar. The entire time of his reign, 11 years, he rebels against the king. And for that, Zedekiah gets his eyes put out. And for that, Zedekiah ends up dying. And before that, all of Zedekiah's sons died. This shows you that when God brings judgment to a land, and it's God's judgment, you know how you're supposed to respond to it? Go with it.
Yeah.
You submit. You don't fight back. I hate that truth, but it's a truth. It's a truth. And the reason for that is it's God's judgment on the land.
Yeah.
God says, and you want to know it, what you do is you got to read how Jeremiah said to deal with it. Jeremiah tells them how to deal with it. He says, if you'll submit, if you'll just let them come in and take the city, you'll live.
Yeah.
But if you run, if you flee, if you fight back and rebel, you're dead. And they didn't believe him. They locked up Jeremiah in the prison for it. And Jeremiah ends up living. And all the peasants of the land, the servants, the lowlifes, the nobodies, the ones who weren't looking to fight back, they all lived. And it was out of them that you get what? You get the rebuilding of the nation of Israel. It's out of them. In Ezra and Nehemiah. It's because they stayed still and trusted the Lord. Whereas Zedekiah and the rest of them didn't do that. It's a terrible truth. It really is. And but it's how God, had it play out, at least in the nation of Israel. If it's different for Americans, well, that's up for you to decide, but I don't know. All right, so, and it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and pitched forts against it, and built forts against it round about. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then was the city broken up, and all the men of war fled, and went forth out of the city by night by the way of the gate between the 2 walls, which was by the king's garden. Now the Chaldeans were by the city round about, and they went up by the way out of the city. Let me see how far I want to read here. Where am I? Are we in 52? We're in 52. All right, that's pretty good there. And then what you find out is eventually they find Zedekiah and they take him captive and then kill his sons. Look at Jeremiah 32. So that famine lasts 2 years until the city is broken up and then Nebuchadnezzar comes in and conquers it. Basically what a kingdom will do when it comes up against the kingdom, especially in these times, they'll just starve them out.
Yeah.
You just starve them out. And that's a great way to win a battle. You just patient. God's in no hurry.
Yeah.
You know, God's like, all right, I'll just squeeze the life out of you, and then eventually you're going to give in or you're going to take off and flee. And what God told them to do was just to stay put, sit still. And those that did, again, lived, and those that fled like cowards and disobeyed God died. And those that stuck behind to fight and met the same death. All right, Jeremiah 32, look at verse 24. This is the famine as a result of Jerusalem's sin. Jeremiah 32, 24. Behold the mounts, they are come unto the city to take it, and the city is given into the hand of the Chaldeans that fight against it, because of the sword and of the famine and of the pestilence. And what thou hast spoken is come to pass, and behold, thou seest it. Let's see. Look at verse 30. For the children of Israel and the children of Judah have only done evil before me from their youth. For the children of Israel have only provoked me to anger with the work of their hands, saith the Lord. For this city hath been to me as a provocation of my anger and of my fury from the day that they built it, even unto this day, that I should remove it from before my face, because of all the evil of the children of Israel and of the children of Judah, which they have done to provoke me to anger. They, their kings, their princes, their priests, their prophets, and the men of Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, they turned unto me the back, not the face, though I taught them, rising up early, teaching them, yet have they not hearkened to receive instruction, but they set their abominations in the house, which is called by my name, to defile it. They built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass with the fire unto Moloch, which I command them not, neither came it into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. So for all of that sin there, God says, you're done. I'm through with you. And they go into captivity for 70 years. And eventually God gets them out of that. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuild the city. You know the story there. And the next famine doesn't come in Scripture until we get into the New Testament, which we'll cover next. That we cover will be found in the book of Acts, and we'll get there at some point.